Welcome to this BrightTALK GDPR Cybersecurity panel discussion, part of the BrightTALK GDPR Summit. My name is Raef Meeuwisse and I'll be the moderator for today's session. In this interactive session, we really want to encourage as many cybersecurity relevant GDPR questions as possible from the audience, and you will see within the BrightTALK panel there's a place to ask your questions. So please keep those coming. We want to provide the insights from the panelists, who today are we've got Julian Saunders, who's CEO of PORT.im, and hopefully joining us shortly into it is also going to be Bob Honor, but he might be a little bit late into this. So just moving forwards into this, before we introduce the members of the panel, I want to start the first vote from the audience. And in this particular vote, which is anonymous, by the way, so we don't know who you are when you're answering and responding to this, our first question to the audience is, if GDPR applies to your organization, which hopefully it does if you're here, when do you expect to achieve full compliance by? And there are four options there: by Friday, May 25th, which is of course the day that GDPR goes live, before the end of 2018, sometime during 2019, or if you don't know yet, there's an option for that at the end as well. So please feel free to start the voting now on that, and we'll close that off in about 10 minutes time. Right, well, we're going to cover various things during the agenda, but this really is your session, so please feel free to raise your questions and start firing those through. And in the meantime, I'm first of all going to start with Julian to do a quick introduction about himself. Julian.
Hi, Raef. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm Julian Saunders. I'm CEO and co-founder of PORT.im. PORT.im is a personal data governance platform, and it's a cloud service. It integrates with all the various SaaS services that many businesses use. We came to this from a lot of experience gained in dealing with personal data. In particular, my team and I built one of the biggest personal data-driven commercial services in Europe, and gained a lot of insights from government and regulators as to what was required. So looking forward to being able to contribute to the challenges that people have, and helping out to answer whatever awkward questions people are encountering today.
Excellent. Thanks ever so much, Julian. I'm not sure if we have Bob here as yet. Bob, are you on the line?
I am, and good afternoon, everyone.
Excellent.
Apologies for being a bit last minute. I'll just introduce myself. My name's Bob Honor. I'm the European Marketing Director of SonicWALL. I've worked in the technology industry for the last 25 years, so a lot of experience around security. And obviously today I'm here to talk about how that relates to GDPR and some of the issues that you all need to be aware of moving forwards.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Bob. Myself, I am Raef Meeuwisse. I'm an ISACA governance expert and also an independent author of books like Cybersecurity for Beginners. My operational experience in the security area, so I've been Global Program Director for Security and Privacy at a FTSE 100, and I've written the security and privacy frameworks at a couple of multi-billion-dollar global organizations. So I have a little bit of practical experience in that kind of area. Okay, so what we want to do, though, is find out from the panel what their views are on various things. So first kind of question is GDPR important beyond EU to non-EU based businesses? So if you're working maybe for a subsidiary or outside of the EU, is GDPR still relevant? So Julian, I think I'm going to hand to you for this first question. What are your views on this?
This is a fascinating area because, as I'm sure everybody knows, the EU has written the regulations so that it affects every business that handles the data of EU citizens, no matter where they are globally. And there's a real purpose in that. And I should also say that GDPR doesn't stand alone as being the only personal data regulation that's happening in the world. This is a global trend. It's being enforced by governments across the globe. The one remaining major territory, of course, is the US, and we can talk about that, and I'm sure some of our audience will have some questions about that, particularly in relation to what's gone on with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, etc. But to understand why GDPR is important globally, we have to look at some of the underlying drivers of GDPR. There is a reason that it's a combination of cybersecurity and personal data regulation, and that fundamentally is there to underpin the trust and integrity of digital channels, so that we all as citizens and consumers can trust the digital channels that we interact with on a daily basis. So that, of course, is very important to the future. But for businesses, this is absolutely imperative that businesses embrace GDPR, because by doing that, they're actively participating in the trusted digital channels that they should be a part of if they want to thrive in the future. So that's why it's so important to countries, no matter where they are, that they look at GDPR and they seek to comply.
Excellent. Thank you, Julian. And just before I pass over to Bob to find out if you've got any additional comments on that, just a reminder to those who've joined slightly further in that we've got a live vote that's open for when you think you'll be compliant by, and the vote is anonymous. So we don't know who you are or what options you're voting for, but please feel free to join in that vote. Bob, anything else you think is relevant on this particular topic?
I think obviously most of the key points have been mentioned. I think one of the things that I've seen in the industry generally is a lot of non-EU based businesses have sort of taken up the GDPR baton a lot longer or a lot later than our European colleagues. So it's only now we're starting to see a lot of American organisations particularly start to take GDPR seriously, and they're all running to address the requirements of GDPR. But I think we're seeing a global change in terms of people's privacy, and I think it's a game changer in terms of making the individuals responsible for their information and who has it, rather than organisations using the individuals as the product that they use to resell their services.
Good response. And we've had a first question in from the audience, so this is a really interesting one. And I know we probably want to stay away from commercial recommendations, but I think that we'll probably have some interesting things to say on this. So the question from the audience, first question is, can anyone recommend a company who would do some data science related activities on any data extracts we collate as part of a subject data access request? We are 100% cloud-based, and a real-life access request last year resulted in 35,000 documents that had to be reviewed. A mammoth task. How are other organisations set up to facilitate a data access request? We are 100% digital, no paper records. So I think this is a really fascinating question, and I am happy to start the ball rolling before I think I'll go to Bob first on this after. So Bob, just if you want to get your brain in gear for that one. So what I have seen happening in these kind of things is the preparation of machine learning algorithms and neural kind of botnets that can crawl for information. But ultimately, what you flagged there is that you might have quite a lot of unstructured personal information, and reactive is possibly not the optimal way of doing it. And as we'll cover later on, data discovery is a big challenge for a lot of organizations. So there are definitely services out there that can be tapped into, and they can do some of it. But I think that part of the key, and very much aligned with cybersecurity, is whenever you collect or bring in information, if it's about particular data subjects, it really helps enormously if you can tie that information together at the identity point, as in if you've got a common identity and access platform or a way of correlating that, you're going to make life significantly easier. If you don't, then there are data discovery methods that can be used to crawl through massive data lakes, and I saw one recently from an organization I used to work with where they were employing massive amounts of cloud CPU power in order to be able to fire off these neural networks and discover personal information in data lakes and try and put it into some structure for subject access requests, deletion, etc. So Bob, anything else you'd like to add to that particular item?
No, I think one of the key things, depending on the industry or the vertical market that organisations are in. So obviously one of the first cuts you can do is obviously work out if the general documents contain personal information or not, because obviously where there's a lot of documentations, if you can halve that by saying the chances are there's no personal information because maybe they're design documents, for example, or something like that. So I think it's a case of trying to split the data into manageable chunks, and then, as you say, use the data lakes and the other services to sift through it in more detail. But I think the other thing as well is, how old are those documents? Obviously, if they're over 12 months or something like that, I think you need to question as to whether or not you still need to keep them online.
And Julian, that presents an interesting question in itself, doesn't it, in terms of the value of the information versus the requirements to not keep unnecessary amounts of personal information. Have you got any insights or anything from your experience of assisting organisations with their GDPR compliance?
Yes, very much so. This is a really interesting question because, of course, so many businesses out there have historically just gathered data and haven't put the structures in place to cater for a subject access request. So, Raef, I think your first response was absolutely correct. In the future, it's very easy for us to say now, but we should be planning that the data that we collect is, even if it's unstructured data, it should be defined in a way that makes it clear as to whether it's part of personal data, whether it would need to be drawn together in a subject access request. And of course, we should structure all of our data collection now in a way that optimizes subject access requests. And the question that we're coming across a lot with businesses that we're dealing with is, what exactly should we include in a data subject access request? To what extent does the data we hold impinge on the individual? And do we need to provide it all? And of course, under GDPR, the answer is fundamentally you do need to provide all the data that relates directly or could be identified with that individual. So in some businesses that could be slightly compromising. So the other point of whether some of this data should be thrown away is also very important. Businesses should look at the data they're holding, understand clearly why they're holding it. Is there a value to it? Is it purely regulatory? Is there any need for that data? Because excess data should really be deleted wherever possible.
Yeah, I hope that information is encrypted. But anyway, an entirely different question for later on. So the next question from the audience, which is very timely for the slide as well, if firms are not compliant by 25th of May, can they show they are working towards compliance? Will that satisfy the authorities? And before I go to Julian, first of all, for that, I'm going to look at the poll. The poll, by the way, audience members, if you've joined and you haven't voted, you've got a few seconds left to do so. The poll is anonymous, and it's, do you expect to be compliant by the deadline on Friday, as in Friday, May 25th? So I'm just going to stop the voting now so we can see what the results are. Now, interestingly enough, ISACA had done a GDPR readiness poll, released a few days ago with thousands of survey respondents, and what they found was very similar to what we're seeing on this poll here. They actually had 29% of their respondents saying that they expected to be fully compliant by Friday, May 25th. And in this poll here, we've got 30%, so that looks like a very strong correlation, and similar kind of results elsewhere as well. So interesting to see that further 47% are expecting to meet full compliance by the end of 2018, 10% sometime during 2019, and 10% we have no idea yet. So interesting. So Julian, what's your view on if you're not compliant by 25th of May, but you show you're working towards compliance, do you think that's going to satisfy the supervisory authorities like the ICO in the UK?
So I was lucky enough to share a platform with David Teague from the ICO earlier this week, on Monday actually. And so I heard it from the ICO directly. They are fully understanding that businesses need to get to grips with GDPR. They also understand the complexities. They realize that it's a principles-based piece of legislation. It's open to a lot of interpretation. But they do want to see businesses making progress in this space and doing what they can do. But it's highly unlikely that they're going to come down heavily on anybody who hasn't fully implemented GDPR by the 25th, although businesses will be expected to have shown that they've made some kind of practical moves in the right direction, and that will need to be followed up certainly over the coming months.
Excellent. And Bob, your views from a cybersecurity perspective? I mean, I was thinking, for example, that the first organizations that are probably going to be heavily scrutinized are the ones that suffer data breaches that are disclosed on or after Friday the 25th of May. So from that perspective, if you were, for example, to suffer a big data breach, do you think that the supervisory authorities will give you a break if you show you're working towards compliance?
I think it comes down to the size of it and the readiness, etc., that the organisation's up to. As we've already discussed, the likes of Facebook and Google have made a lot of changes to their privacy T's and C's for good reasons, as we're all aware. I think, really sort of confirm with the comments earlier that, as long as people are moving in the right direction, it depends, if data's encrypted, if you have a big breach and, for example, your data's not encrypted, I don't think the regulatory authorities would look kindly on that as an example. You've got to show willing, you've got to be moving the things in the right direction, you've got to have a reasonable amount of security, or, have started and moving the plans. Two-stage authentication, things like that are good examples of ways organisations can make changes to make their data structure more secure. So I think, it's a difficult one until a case comes to court. I think, more and more organisations taking it seriously, moving in the right direction. It's just a case of implementing and delivering. Yeah.
And Bob, again, a question for you to start on maybe, and then to Julian after that. So there's a question from the audience here really about security by design and privacy by design. So this particular person said in their experience they've seen that push towards embedding security into the business activities, DevSecOps as it's popularly referred to. So do you think GDPR is really going to mean that we're going to see DevSecPrivOps? Any views on that one?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't got any specific views on that particular one.
Okay. So, Julian, any view on whether or not you're seeing privacy requirements and security requirements now more fundamentally embedded into the policies and the practices of the organisations you've been working with?
Not necessarily those two, although I did meet with a tech business yesterday that have done a lot of work in this space. Specifically for GDPR, and I was amazed at the extent to which they've gone for their security aspects. In their particular circumstance, it was a deliberate attempt to ensure that they have better security than any of their competitors. So they're really using that as a competitive advantage in their marketplace, which I thought was very interesting. We're also seeing a massive increase in interest in how consent is gained. And I think there'll be a lot of experimentation and best practice examples coming out of consent management, which is definitely becoming an area of real interest, particularly to marketers. How that consent's gained at the initial point, how it's communicated, how it's maintained, and the user experience behind that, I think, is probably going to become an area of considerable expertise.
Yeah. And I think from my own perspective in the privacy by design as well as security by design is a very worthwhile way forwards. But what I see often is that only really very, very large organizations or organizations that are themselves solution providers are often engaged in development, because for many organizations they are literally picking and configuring cloud options and solutions rather than perhaps building their own. But it is definitely the more cost-effective and more efficient way to go. To provide a couple of examples, obviously, even in GDPR and ICO guidance, they expect you to do these data protection impact assessments from the get-go. So from the very beginning, you should be considering the privacy needs. It's going to be considerably more expensive if somebody still slips through the net and releases systems or tooling that uses personal information, and then you have to do retrospective remediation on it. So definitely privacy as well as security by design is very worthwhile doing. I also had to do some analysis when putting together a very large security and privacy governance framework, as in what was the differential between, say, cybersecurity and data protection. And it was very interesting because actually data protection pretty much said you have to do everything required of good information security and cybersecurity, and then in addition you have these other requirements on consent, subject access rights, notification of breaches, etc. So that was interesting to note that there's a lot of overlap. So if you're doing security by design, you're probably doing a lot of what is required from the security perspective of GDPR, but there are obviously a lot of other considerations to implement and put in that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to open the next poll for the audience. So audience, the next question is, has GDPR changed your organization's approach to cybersecurity? And there are three options here. Whether or not GDPR has increased our organization's investment in cybersecurity, GDPR has decreased the priority of cybersecurity, or no change. So those are the options. Feel free to vote now. In the meantime, going to go on to the next question from the audience. Here's an interesting one. Sometimes GDPR potentially can be in conflict with regulations. So there's a question here, read the data access question, subject access, etc. We are SC regulated, so 7-year retention on some of it. And I think the question is, what do you do if you find that your GDPR requirements are in conflict with other regulatory requirements around the EU? So Julian, do you feel comfortable with that one, or?
This is one we come up against a lot of times. We were lucky enough to have a lot of contact with FCA-regulated firms, so we know exactly how this one plays out. Of course, the FCA regulations are incredibly important. Yes, information has to be retained for 7 years. There should be no conflict in the 7-year retention, and of course a data subject access request for portability of that data. So that can be very difficult, of course, if it's in unstructured form, but that's relatively straightforward. The issue really here is if an individual makes a right to be forgotten request, and that has to be broken down into 2 steps. The right to be forgotten can be actioned in terms of the marketing and future marketing communications with that particular customer, but that right to be forgotten does not override the 7-year retention requirement of the FCA. So under those circumstances, effectively, an FCA-regulated firm is offering or retaining data on 2 bases if they are marketing to their customers. The first basis is contract, if they are a client and they've sold them a product, so that's fairly straightforward. If they continue to market services, then ideally they should also have a consent in place for those marketing services, and when that data subject access request is made for deletion, then the consent agreement falls away and the contract basis is maintained, and providing that's communicated back to the individual at that point of deletion request, then that should be satisfactory.
Yeah, I had a brilliant example in a session where somebody said, if I send a data deletion request to the bailiffs actually have to get rid of my details, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, there are provisions under GDPR to make sure that if you have to do some lawful processing and you need to have that data, you won't actually be breaking GDPR if you have a lawful basis for processing that requires it, provided you're not keeping it for undue time, etc. So, Bob, anything else any other insights on the regulatory side of GDPR and when it comes into conflict with other security considerations or regulations?
No, I think Julian just covered the key one that was raised, and fully support and agree with exactly what he said in that respect. It's the FCA regulations, etc., have to take precedence over and above GDPR. But
okay, and
stop marketing.
Bob, again, this one's probably more up your street, but I'm interested in the subject and the topic of encryption as well as pseudonymization. I nearly mucked up the pronunciation of that. If you were using Office 365 as a main system, is there an additional need around encryption for a robust enough system from the audience? So I know this is a Microsoft-specific question, so we might not have the particular response for that. However, thinking about encryption generally, I don't know, Bob, if you know the answer to that particular question, but how do you see the encryption requirements of GDPR?
I think the encryption is a very, very key point, because if we just look at the traffic that's traversing the internet today, around about 70% of the traffic that's going around the internet is encrypted. And whilst that's good, the downside of that is most malware, and obviously the malware that can start to do the key logging and forming the basis of a data breach or a way into an organization, that information is coming into organizations in encrypted connections. So one of the things that's really, really key here is to make sure that people are doing full deep packet inspection at the point of entry into the organization to be able to spot that malware and the other things that are going to subsequently probably cause data breaches. So encryption's key, but also being able to obviously check and understand exactly what information's coming through that perimeter firewall is also very important as well.
Yeah, there is a kind of natural conflict between the encryption requirements for personal information and the need to be able to absolutely scrutinize files at points in order to be able to tell whether or not there's any malware. Now, one of the areas in GDPR where it's quite cunning is around encryption, because I was, in preparation for this call as well, just trying to make sure that I understood exactly the GDPR take on encryption. And maybe this does actually partially answer the Office 365 question. So what the regulation seems to require is that you take appropriate security, technical and process measures to keep the data safe. And it is explicit from the supervisory authorities, for example, the ICO, that effectively they recognize there are points in the life cycle where that text may need to be unencrypted because, for example, when you're processing it has to be in plain view. However, they did state that, in the event of a data breach, for example, if your data has been stolen or a copy of it's taken and it wasn't encrypted, they will most likely pursue legal action because they would consider that you hadn't taken sufficient security measures or safeguards. So in terms of encryption, it seems to be the case that you should encrypt it to a reasonable standard, so whatever the commercially acceptable encryption standard is at the time, and unless, if you did lose a large store of that data, I believe they also give you some degree of leniency. So, for example, if you were to lose a large chunk of information, but it was correctly, heavily encrypted, that you would still have to make the right notifications to the supervisory authority, but you won't necessarily have to contact all of the individuals if you can prove that that encryption will not be able to be broken and therefore would not cause harm to the data subjects. So it's an interesting area. Julian, do you have any insights on encryption and pseudonymization?
It's not it's not really my area of expertise, to be honest. Obviously, I think you know, when you come back to the principles of privacy by design, yes, of course, everything should be encrypted in transit and at rest where possible. But I defer to you guys as the experts in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I think that that is relatively clear. But audience, keep those questions coming. We had another interesting one about, you know, if you've got a company that's incorporated in the EU, they're working with EU customers, providing them regulated online services, but perhaps they have staff outside of the European Union. Does that mean that the personal data is transferred outside the EEA because those employees have access to systems in order to provide customer service function? I think this one's straightforward. Julian, you first on this one.
I haven't come across this before, but my reading of that would be that that data does fall under, obviously it falls under GDPR, and it is viewable and visible and accessible outside of the EEA. So therefore, it is considered to have moved or be available outside the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, I have come across that quite a bit, and in fact, I even had an example where they were saying, oh, you know, the servers are still resident in the European Union, and the people are just going to be looking at virtualized instances, so that the screen is, you know, in Singapore or wherever. So does that mean that we've transferred the data out? And the answer from the data protection lawyers was, yes, it does. So you can't get around it. If it's going to be able to be accessed, which means even viewed, even if it's viewed remotely, then, you know, GDPR applies. So that's EU privacy information. Bob, any insights on that from you?
Yeah, I think just one other point I'd like to make is obviously, you know, when you're using Office 365 or you're using other tools like maybe Salesforce, etc., obviously the servers behind that are all located somewhere. I think something a lot of organisations also need to consider is, you know, it's possible to pull information out of those systems, put it into a spreadsheet, etc. Now, obviously, sending that spreadsheet containing those personal details around an organisation is something else to be considered. We probably all see that sort of information on a regular basis. Those spreadsheets should be encrypted as well as a minimum, because it's still people's personal information that could be attached to an email and sent out of an organisation, etc. So it's not just where the servers are, it's where the data ends up. Any data on a laptop in any shape or form should be encrypted for security and privacy reasons, obviously.
Excellent, thank you. So following on from that, one of the other things that I saw from an ISACA Gdp Our Readiness Poll was that when they were looking at the top challenges that organisations were saying they were having with meeting their compliance requirements for this regulation, the number one challenge, or the challenge with 52% respondents saying that they found this problem, was data discovery, was actually identifying what personal information they held. So I know we partially looked at this in an earlier question from the audience, but do you have any tips or procedures or insights into the best way that organisations can look to do that data discovery exercise? So Julian, you've got platform experience with this. Any particular insights on how various organisations can go around solving that data discovery challenge?
I think it very much depends on the scale of the organisation and the complexity and the diversity in terms of the nature of that personal data. Certainly with smaller businesses, as a little prompter, we offer a little tool that pings their website and it identifies what kind of applications they have running and gives them a starting set of those that would be holding personal data. That's very high level, and it's purely web-based. In a more sophisticated organisation, I think the way that we've seen works best is to break it down, set up an individual person within each department, within each area section, however the business is organized, that becomes responsible for GDPR, focus the initial training on that individual, make them aware of what to look for, and recruit them to become an assistant in working out what personal data goes into that department, where it's stored, how it's used, who it's shared with, how long it's for, and then the other parameters, and that will be collated. But those are the main areas that we see.
Excellent, thank you. And Bob, what about your own insights into that challenge of data discovery? What do you see as the easiest or the best ways of
what I've seen most organisations do when it comes to that data discovery is obviously similar to what Julian said, ask a key lead in each department to document what data comes into the department, who processes it, how it's processed it, and feed all that information back to form that bigger picture at a corporate level as to the data flow, where the data is stored, so that the requisite safeguards can be put in place going forwards.
Yeah, and I would say this piece of tip or guidance is quite important. I see cybersecurity and data privacy both as business opportunities and process engineering requirements. So I've audited lots and lots of organizations for security and privacy, and the ones that run the most effectively and the most efficiently have great process engineering. So if I can provide an example for the data discovery, if you've got a good process that basically is accessible, easy to understand, and simple to use, and you place the responsibility for following the process on the business, because only the business can understand what personal information they have, where they hold it, where they use it, why they need it. So if there's, if you own the process for saying, we need to have an inventory, we need to track where it flows, we need to understand what you're using it for, what you have in it. If you own the process for capturing that and you make it accessible, then you don't own the data discovery problem, you own the data discovery engineering, and then you own how you process, analyze, and resolve the actionable items that resolve. So that would be my tip on the data collection and data discovery side. Another slightly technical question. So Bob, I'm going to ask you this one. Is password protecting a document a good level of protection when sending it through non-encrypted email? So Bob, your views on that?
Well, password protection doesn't always mean encryption, would be my first comment. So whilst you need a password to open it, most people can crack those with various tools to get into it. I think, obviously making sure the document is encrypted makes it a lot safer than just pure password protection, would be my guidance.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think, if you went to any supervisory authority and said, we've lost this document, it was password protected, they would, not consider that to be adequate level of security. I mean, it is a level of security, but I don't think it would be considered adequate, especially not for personal information. Okay, so the next question is interesting for the audience. If one of my users gets caught out by a phishing email and enters their Microsoft login credentials, Julian, I'm coming to you on this one, will this type of security breach have to be reported under GDPR as a data breach? So, small, simple attacks like that, does that need to be reported?
Okay, so what I will say is, again, what I've heard from the ICO on Monday is that they had approximately 2,000 reports of breaches last year, and they're expecting a tenfold increase, so somewhere around 20,000 reports of breaches this year. Whether that constitutes a breach, I think, you guys are the cybersecurity experts. It doesn't. I don't know whether the account has been compromised physically, but certainly the access to that account has been compromised, and so I would guess that is a breach. But what's your view?
Bob, I will pass to you in a second. But my view on this is it kind of depends what it's going to lead to and what that login might get you into or how that might be used. So in itself, it is a minor breach. I would suggest that it's not going to be something that, especially given what's going on, in of itself, that supervisory authority would be interested in. However, if that happens to be an account that you're using that safeguards a trove of 250,000 data subject records, and they subsequently get, a copy of those gets taken. So I think it's not so much the individual action as the potential consequences of it that are important to note. So a lot of the time, risks are looked at in silos, as in people will see something small and they'll see something else small. And there's a danger that, for example, if you see 250 phishing emails where the same attack has worked, or 500, are those 500 notifiable events? I'm sure the supervisory authorities would say, individually, they're not perhaps materially relevant, but what they could do or the overall pattern is definitely something significant. Bob, your views on this?
I think obviously what's happening here is phishing emails are quite common, definitely increasing. There's a variety of tools that can be put in place that can actually stop those getting to the employee in the first place. So I think, prevention is a lot better than cure. And I think, making sure that people have got all the latest security updates and they've rolled them all out, etc., is a key way of doing it. And obviously at the end of the day, when it comes to GDPR, security is only as strong as the weakest link. And I think, a lot of organizations need to look at rolling out sort of training to staff and employees to teach people how to spot those emails that are phishing and doing other things that aren't very nice to people. So I think, as I say, it comes down to education and making sure you've got the latest security on the infrastructure as well. Key goals that you can help to mitigate those sort of things happening in the first place.
Yeah, and in terms of the weakest link, I saw interesting observation by Mark Vail, who's the president of the ISACA Belgium chapter yesterday, who said he doesn't think that humans are the weakest link anymore. He thinks it's the board decision-making process that is possibly the weakest link, so that was quite good. Yeah, but in terms of breach notification, I think we've got to be clear, it's personal information that's, the key here. Has personal information that can cause harm to individuals been lost? And if that is the case or stolen, then obviously there's going to be some kind of requirement for making the relevant notifications. So it's not so much has that one credential been compromised as, what can that one credential access? So, okay. So moving forwards on this, evaluating cyber risk. So just how profound do we think the risk and the cyber risk is? I mean, so for example, as of May 25th, is personal information at greater cyber risk than it was before the regulation goes live because the ransom value is higher? Bob, do you want to take this first of all? Do you think that the cyber threats are going to increase as a result of GDPR or decrease or stay the same?
I think they'll probably stay about the same, to be honest with you. I based that on several sort of independent bits of research that we've seen just in terms of what activity we're seeing being fed back from our various probes that we've got out there. So I think it will stay the same, but I think what will happen is when it does happen, it will probably get more press coverage as a result of GDPR, if that makes sense.
It does. And Julian, in terms of the same kind of thing, obviously there are things like the data protection impact assessments. How do you see the cyber risk angle of what you're seeing with the organisations that you're supporting through your platform? Have you seen that they are very aware of cyber security as a key component of the GDPR risk? Or?
So I think this really depends on the type of organisation. You talked earlier about those kind of developer-heavy organisations where they're building out their own applications, and certainly in highly technically savvy businesses, they are putting a lot of focus into into reducing cyber risk. But in businesses where that isn't really their focus, what we're seeing is that people are deciding to move now to cloud services and take this opportunity to effectively remove themselves from the primary points of risk and to offload that cyber risk into the cloud, which kind of relates to the question we had earlier around Office 365. If you've got very little personal data on your own servers or possibly none, then your risk of being hacked is vastly reduced. And that certainly seems to be an approach that many medium-sized businesses are taking.
And another key area of cyber risk that I'd like to come to both of you on is the risk from suppliers. So I think this is often overlooked. I know from my experience, I've been into over 50 suppliers on audits of mainly security, and about half of them on security and privacy at the same time. Some of the pitfalls I've seen is that, first of all, there's just a standard, you do security right, tick box that comes out. In the contract, there's no security architecture that stipulates things like encryption in transit, encryption arrest standards. They don't actually look at what the supplier's doing. So as I say, they've just got one-size-fits-all security requirements that aren't always correct or relevant. They don't consider, the end of contract requirements. What do we do with the data at the end of it? What the expectations and stipulations are on encryption and pseudonymization. I'm going to learn how to pronounce that word correctly before the end of the session. And they don't do any due diligence, especially the biggest challenge is often that organizations will go and check on the suppliers they're spending the most money with, but not necessarily the cheap suppliers that they have the most risk with, where they're processing data at the lowest possible cost. So any insights on the use of suppliers? Bob, come to you first on this one.
I think it's a key one. I mean, you've just got to look at the supply chain model, whereas, most organizations use third-party suppliers for something, and those third-party suppliers might then also use third-party suppliers. So following that whole data chain really comes down to doing that sort of data process audit that we talked about earlier, to work out what bit data is being processed and who's processing it, etc. I mean, if you look at the supply chain model where you've got distributors, you've got resellers, you've got end users, there's obviously lots of other organizations as part of that supply chain doing various parts. It all needs to be mapped, and then obviously business risk assessment done on all of it so that people can conform. And I think, coming back to the question at the beginning of the session about when will you be GDPR compliant, I think these are the sort of things that are still going to take organizations a number of months to complete that process. The larger the organization, the longer it's going to take.
Absolutely. And Julian, in terms of the significance of the supplier component in GDPR compliance, how do you see that in the context of what you've been doing?
Well, this really is a fascinating area because historically, as you say, people have been relatively lax in auditing suppliers. And I guess that it could never have been highlighted more than Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Where data leaves an organization, who it goes to, is now going to be far more critical to the original data controller. Effectively, we're going to have clear boundaries between organizations. When data is going from one organization to another, we need to be very clear about what data is being transferred, what it's going to be used for, what levels of security will be applied, what's happening at the end of the contract or at the end of the processing session, what ability the original controller has to regain access to that data for things like subject access requests, and effectively the passporting of data between organizations is going to become an absolutely critical area. And as we just talked about the distribution chain going from one controller to another controller to another controller, very quickly control can be lost. And what we've seen with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is, of course, that Cambridge Analytica was a very small organization in comparison, doing pretty bad things with data. And the impact has been on Facebook. Facebook is the one that's taken the brunt of the impact. Facebook's the one that's had to go and answer in Washington. Facebook is the one that's still having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on patching up their privacy and regulation. And really, I think that shows that it doesn't matter whether you're the wrongdoer, the bad actor or not. If you're passing data to an organization that's misusing that information or is lax in their security, then you are going to be responsible one way or another, and will have to suffer the consequences. So, and the other thing I think is really important is that, as Bob's saying, the audit has to be carried out. There has to be risk assessments, and they have to be ongoing and continuous, because there is no moment in time when you can state that you're fully compliant. If there's data being moved out to a subcontractor, then it has to be monitored on a regular basis. What are they still doing with that data? What they were originally asked to do with it? It's a big area, and it's one that, as Bob says, is going to take some time to work its way through the system, and for businesses to work out the physical processes and the legal processes for retaining control and ensuring that liability and responsibility for that data is clear and maintained.
Yep. And I thought you were going to say Facebook were having to spend hundreds of millions on Mark Zuckerberg's flight and accommodation then, but anyway.
Well, they obviously didn't spend millions on his suit, that's for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the voting on the has GDPR changed your organization's approach to cybersecurity. Absolutely no votes for saying GDPR has decreased the priority of cybersecurity. 59% saying that investment has increased, and 40% saying that it hasn't changed, and a mythical 1% missing somewhere in the rounding. So that's interesting. I think we've got time for just hopefully one more question before we go into the summing up. Please also remember to leave your feedback. Let us know how much you did or didn't enjoy this. Hopefully 5 stars is always welcome. But anyway, so GDPR, the question of the audience is, GDPR is today's best of breed, as in probably the leading privacy regulation on the planet, and therefore it brings value. It may be obvious, but we haven't stated this at this point. Do we believe that it really is the best regulation? So what are our views on GDPR? Is it the right way forward, and do we see any shortcomings in it? So Julian, don't know if you want to go first on that particular question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm a great supporter of the GDPR. I think it's a very clever piece of legislation. I think it's very timely. I think it's absolutely essential that all of us, as business owners and operatives, get a grip on what is going to be essential to our futures. Every business, no matter how it operates, has an aspect of digital interaction. And almost all businesses maintain some access to personal data. So it's fundamental to keep the trust of consumers that personal data is managed correctly. It's also fundamental that cybersecurity levels are increased so that we can all be far more trusting in the digital channels that we have available to us. And I think the way that the EU has gone about this, writing it in very much a principles-based approach, is correct. So businesses don't really need to go through and tick boxes when they come to compliance around GDPR. It's much more about, are they open, are they transparent, and are they doing their best to build trust with their customers?
And Bob, your thoughts on GDPR? Is it a welcome regulation? Does it do all of the right things, and do you see any shortcomings?
I think it's definitely welcome. I think it was needed. I think, if we look at some of the global organisations, they are adopting GDPR, even though they're not European-based. Obviously, if you look at the likes of Facebook as a good example, a lot of their privacy settings are based around the GDPR recommendations, etc. And I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think it's the best the world's got at the moment. I think it will evolve, it will change as people sort of work out the practical implications of what we're working with today.
Yeah, and I echo both of your sentiments. I do think that, definitely the substantial financial penalties or potential financial penalties seem to be something that's actually operating like a wake-up call. and making major organisations that we thought potentially never take privacy all that seriously for a change. I do think there are going to be some interesting points where the regulation might need a little bit of refinement. And I noticed, for example, that if you need a data protection officer, that the data protection officer is going to have better access to a board than the cybersecurity function. And in my experience in years gone by, what I've found is that business engineering is quite key. I mean, obviously you want to achieve maximum business value. Most data protection officers have some kind of legal training, not always. But what I found was the people that can consult most on, for example, the law in terms of GDPR, and the people that can perhaps provide you the optimum solutions are not necessarily the same individuals. So I think that could play out in an interesting way. But I definitely think it is the best regulation for privacy on the planet. So I echo those sentiments. So just a few minutes left, so perhaps a bit of summing up. So Julian, do you have any final comments and words of wisdom that you would like to share with the audience?
I do. I'd like to pose to the audience a thought that they can take away, and that is that a massively understated aspect of GDPR is data portability. That is making the data that you have available around individuals, giving it to that individual in a machine-readable format. This is a very important part of the regulation. It's something that the governments, all European governments, are taking very seriously. And there's a reason behind it. And the reason is that it is to loosen up emerging markets and make data that's currently locked in very large organizations available to innovative, new, personalized products and service providers. So if you're a business sitting there thinking, this is quite painful, all this compliance, maybe the other aspect of what you could be thinking about is, first of all, the data that we have in our organization, is there a way we can give this to our customers that will enhance their lives in some way so that they will thank us for making that data available? And secondly, is there a way that you can create better products and services that are more personalized by asking your customers to give you the data from other organizations? And so whether that's giving you insurance data or banking data or travel data, whatever your business is, are there ways that you could be ingesting that data and creating something new and exciting that surprises and delights your customers?
Thank you, Julian. And Bob, passing words from you.
Yeah, I think my sort of passing words and key advice is obviously prevention is a lot better than cure. And obviously if you're going to get a data breach, people will have to get into the system somehow in the first place. So money spent up front on security to provide the best layered approach possible is money well spent. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, more and more traffic is encrypted. So build into your infrastructure the ability to look into that encrypted traffic to stop the malware coming in the first place. And I think GDPR generally is a catalyst to really start to get people's houses in order. It's a bit like ISO 9000 was a few years ago, and obviously Y2K when we were talking about that. Organizations put big teams in place to go through, to do audits, etc. I think GDPR is the start of what's been needed for some time on security. That's some guidance from myself.
Thank you, Bob. And my own insight is, GDPR and resolving it, even for a cybersecurity perspective, is a cross-functional, multi-department effort. So for cybersecurity departments, you need to be brilliant on the basics of cybersecurity and equipping your business with the tools and the processes that they need, and remembering especially to apply appropriate encryption going forwards. So my thanks to the audience for turning up and asking those excellent questions, and especially to the panelists for providing their insights in this. So thank you very much for attending this, and I hope to see you at a future BrightTALK event. Thank you ever so much.